Hello everyone. In this video I'm going to talk about schizophrenia. And schizophrenia is a really sad and debilitating disorder that is very complex and kind of difficult to describe. But it includes disturbances in the person's thought processes and their ability to perceive things accurately. Often they see things and hear things that aren't there. They have difficulty controlling their emotions and also controlling their behavior. And one of the things that's so sad about schizophrenia is that it often hits people in the prime of their life, in their late teens to their early 20s, often people that are very intelligent, very academically successful. I don't know if anybody has seen this movie, A Beautiful Mind, with Russell Crowe, but he actually portrays a real person, John Nash, who's, I think, a world famous mathematician who, as he was attending college, started to disintegrate basically and come down with symptoms of schizophrenia. And he's still alive today and still doing, you know, some academic kind of work, but he still suffers severely from schizophrenia. And he had three sons, and I think one or two of his sons actually have schizophrenia as well. So we know there's a strong genetic component to schizophrenia as well. It's the most debilitating mental illness. Only 1% of the population is diagnosed with schizophrenia. So it's a small portion of the population, but it often hits really young, successful, bright people. So it's really sad, and often it can be very debilitating. So even the medications and treatments that we have don't necessarily fix schizophrenia. It can help with the symptoms, but it doesn't necessarily bring that person back. Sometimes people talk about schizophrenia being a split personality, and the reason why people think that is because it seems like the person grows up as one person, and then once they come down with the symptoms of schizophrenia, it seems like they become another person. But it isn't a split personality. It's not a multiple personality. It's kind of a split with reality, which is what a psychotic disorder is. So psychosis is when a person loses contact with reality. They see things that aren't there. They hear things that aren't there. They may feel things that aren't there. And this can happen during schizophrenia, but it can also occur just from using drugs, even marijuana, LSD, of course. You can have hallucinations. Even medications that your doctor prescribed for you sometimes can cause psychotic symptoms. I used to see a lot of elderly people that were prescribed steroids for breathing issues, and it actually caused them to have some pretty crazy psychotic kind of symptoms, hearing voices, seeing things, and sort of concern their family members, and they'd bring them to the emergency room to get evaluated. And even things like bipolar disorder, even depression, mood disorders, you can have psychotic symptoms. So that does not mean that you have schizophrenia. And many of those causes of psychosis can be fixed. The drugs will wear off, medications will wear off. As your mood improves, the symptoms of psychosis will go away. But with schizophrenia, psychosis is something that's kind of permanent, and the symptoms can sort of wax and wane. They can get more severe and then go back down. So they can go up and down, but it's definitely a disturbance in thinking, behavior, emotions, and the ability to communicate. Delusions and hallucination are the two core features of schizophrenia, but like I said, schizophrenia is a complex disorder, so it's not just delusions and hallucinations. So hallucinations are very easy to understand what they are. Most of us have not experienced a hallucination. Sometimes you might think you see something out of the corner of your eye, or you might have thought you saw a ghost in the dark. That's not really a hallucination, because what you'll do is you'll go and you'll check out and see if that was real, and you realize it's not real. Somebody who has schizophrenia that's hallucination will never even question whether or not that's real. So auditory hallucinations are the most common, and that's hearing voices. And sometimes that voice might be just a running commentary about everything that you're doing or people that are around you. I put a really good video about Lolly, who's a character from Orange is the New Black. And it's a really short video clip, but it's a really good example of what it might be like to have auditory hallucinations and schizophrenia. She's definitely she definitely has a diagnosis diagnosis of schizophrenia. And in the beginning, she seems pretty normal. She's pushing her shopping cart, she's interacting with people in a pretty normal way. But when she gets under stress and the police officers are interviewing her and talking to her, she starts to hear voices that are a little bit paranoid and that the police officers are out to get her. And she is yelling, "Shut up!" And the police officers think that she's yelling that at them, but what she's doing is trying to get the voices to shut up. And then she also reaches into her shopping cart to grab this shaker thing that she uses to drown out the voices. So she knows that she doesn't want to listen to these voices, and she has ways of drowning them out. But under stress, they just overwhelmed her, and she got arrested and put in jail, and that's why she's in Orange is the New Black. So I highly recommend watching that video. So auditory hallucinations, hearing voices. Command hallucinations are where a person hears voices that are telling them to do something, and it could be to harm themselves or others. There's also visual hallucinations where the person sees things that aren't there and actually responds to those things that aren't there. So you may have seen this if you ever go to Circle K or something and you see somebody that's having a psychotic episode. They may be talking to a wall, thinking that there's people there that they're talking to, and there's nobody there. One of the things I do want to mention about schizophrenia is that majority of people with schizophrenia are non-violent, non-threatening, but there are people who have hallucinations and delusions, which we'll talk about here, that somebody might be the devil, and they have command hallucinations that tell them to harm that person, and they can be dangerous, but it's a real small portion of people with schizophrenia. There are also tactile hallucinations or feeling hallucinations, and actually smell hallucinations too. So a lot of people who have psychotic symptoms feel bugs under their skin and other physical sensations. They might think there's something growing in their stomach. So those are hallucinations. Delusions are false beliefs that the person believes are true, even if there's overwhelming evidence against it. The person believes that they're Jesus. That's a grandiose delusion. And you don't really want to try to convince the person how wrong they are, because it can make them angry and it won't get anywhere, unfortunately. So if you have a family member who has odd ideas, who might be schizophrenic, there's no point in trying to convince them otherwise. If they have a delusion, often these are what we call fixed delusions. You can't change them, and it's not really worth trying. So they might believe they're descended from royalty. They may have different religious delusions. They've been sent by God to do something. They may have paranoid delusions. They might believe that somebody's out to get them. They might believe the government's out to get them. The FBI is out to get them. And sometimes paranoid delusions can be dangerous. They can also have what we call ideas of reference, where they think other people can read their thoughts and hear their thoughts. And they also think sometimes that other people can control their thoughts, which is kind of odd. And then they also might think that people on television are speaking directly to them, or celebrities are talking directly to them. And that's one of the things with Twitter and some of the social media sites now, is that people who may have schizophrenia and have a delusion about a particular celebrity might really believe that they have a relationship with that celebrity. So that's one of the reasons why many celebrities have to have security and bodyguards, and they actually have staff of people reviewing all the messages that they get and making sure they respond to anything that's dangerous. And there have been celebrities that have been killed by people who had a delusion that they had this kind of relationship with them when they had no relationship with them at all. So delusions can be really tricky and difficult to understand, and often they're not really treatable. The medications that we have for schizophrenia can be really helpful in treating the hallucinations, but they're not very helpful with delusions at all. So some of the other symptoms of schizophrenia are disorganized thinking. The person's unable to control their thoughts or put together a cohesive sentence. I'm going to show you a letter of somebody that has schizophrenia, and it just, the thought process, it just kind of goes in circles and it doesn't really make sense. Sometimes people with schizophrenia will have really disorganized, dysfunctional behavior. They're, they're purposeless behavior. They don't get dressed, they don't shower, they don't eat, and they can be agitated or they can be catatonic. There used to be a lot of different categories of schizophrenia. There used to be catatonic schizophrenia, paranoid schizophrenia. We don't use those anymore. We just say that the person is diagnosed with schizophrenia and they have catatonic symptoms or paranoid symptoms. And catatonic symptoms, they talk about it as a stupor. It's almost zombie-like, where the person doesn't verbally respond to you or look at you, and they move very slowly. It's pretty rare, but it does occur. Also, their emotional abilities are often affected with schizophrenia as well. So some people with schizophrenia will have what we call a flat affect, where they just don't seem to have any emotions. They just seem very blank. When they talk about things, it's in a really monotone voice, and you think they might be upset about some of their symptoms, and their voice is just really matter of fact about everything. So that's a flat affect. Sometimes people with schizophrenia will have kind of the opposite, where they'll have really inappropriate emotions or affect. They might smile or act silly when you're talking about something serious. They may respond to inner voices while you're trying to ask them questions. And I already mentioned this about not being a split personality or multiple personality disorder. On the last slide, we'll talk about multiple personality disorder. And symptoms do sometimes occur in episodes. They kind of come and go. So they may function pretty well sometimes, and then the symptoms ramp up for whatever reason, under stress sometimes and other things. And they can't cope with the symptoms at that particular point. So this is an example of disturbed verbal communication and disorganized thinking. We used to call it word salad, but it's really where the person's thoughts are uncoordinated. They can't really get things clearly on paper. And this is an example of writing from Jared Loughner. And if you read it, I put rooms and rooms and people and people. It doesn't really make any sense. Nothing is seen, everything has been seen. So he's writing this whole thing, and you can just tell it's not going anywhere. And there's a lot of Jesus Christ and the Antichrist are bonded by blood. Jesus raises hell. He's risen. So it's like he's got all these weird random ideas in here. So his thought process is really not accurate. So I don't know if you guys remember the Tucson shooting in 2011, where Gabby Giffords was shot and six other people were killed, 13 other people were injured. And he was actually a Pima Community College student at the time, and in Tucson, and many of his fellow students in his classes reported him to the administration at the school because they were afraid of him and they were really concerned about his bizarre behavior. And the administration actually did the right thing, contacted his parents and tried to get him help. But one of the problems with our mental health system in the United States is that we can't force anybody over 18 into treatment involuntarily. So if he did not agree to treatment, he didn't think there was anything wrong with him, he didn't want treatment, he refused, and his parents tried to get him to go to treatment, but he refused to go, and there was no way to force him into treatment. We'll talk about that in the last PowerPoint on the last chapter 16 about treatment, but we have laws that say you cannot be committed involuntarily to treatment unless we can prove that you're a danger to yourself or you're a danger to others, and that can be really difficult to prove. So he seemed like a scary guy. He was disorganized. He needed help, and we couldn't get him help. So it's something to think about. I know a lot of people, when we talk about mass shootings and some of these horrible incidents that have happened, and people get really frustrated sometimes, I think, when you hear, oh, the person has mental illness and they want to, they're just trying to get off from that mental illness. And the truth is that what we really need to look at is how can we prevent these kinds of shootings from happening? Not so much the person, should get off. We need to really look at, does this person have potential to be violent again if they're out in the community? And I would say yes for Jared Loughner and yes for James Holmes, excuse me. So that's what's important. And then where's the best place for them as far as getting help and treatment? So we'll talk about that in the treatment segment here. But James Holmes was the Colorado movie theater shooter. He went to the Batman premiere in 2012, dressed himself as the Joker, had all sorts of bizarre delusions, and for whatever reason, he felt this is what he was supposed to do. And he killed 12 people in the movie theater and injured up to 70 people. He had several automatic weapons. But he had been diagnosed with schizophrenia prior to the incident. So he was diagnosed as having schizophrenia, but he was a very brilliant guy. He was a doctoral candidate. He was a graduate student at the University of Colorado, and he was studying neuroscience because he knew that there was something wrong with his own brain. He had actually attempted suicide at age 11, but he was kind of a child genius kind of a kid who was academically very successful, very bright, but something wasn't right with his brain. And, he grew up in a normal family, had very supportive parents, and the defense was hoping to get him committed to life in a mental facility, but he was convicted to life in prison. Um, After the shooting, he was reportedly hearing voices. He believed that people could read his thoughts. He licked the wall of his cell. He threw his body against the wall. He sucked his thumb. So he had some kind of bizarre behaviors when he was arrested. And it was right after the shooting. I think he was right outside the movie theater. He didn't even really try to leave. And he was arrested. So he had some really bizarre behaviors. That would definitely indicate that he wasn't in his right mind. He had actually he sent a notebook to the university psychologist that he was seeing, and it never got delivered to that psychologist. Unfortunately, had she seen it, it might have helped. However, the university and the psychologist that was seeing him, and the psychiatrist, I believe, as well, knew that he was going downhill, knew his symptoms were increasing, and were really concerned about him. And they were having a big meeting about him, and then he just stopped coming to school. And so they didn't do anything. And he's in his mid 20s at this point. So the college, he's an adult, what do you do? So they didn't reach out to his parents, they didn't reach out to him, and they just, and we know what happened. So had somebody intervened, we might have been able to prevent the horrible shootings. So I think that's what we need to really look at as a society, is how can we prevent some of these horrible things from happening, and help people prior to this, because we can never bring back the people that were killed. So this is some of his writing, and it looks very much like Jared Lochner's. Untruth is converted to truth by violence times zero. Uses a lot of math. Very bright guy. So we know that there are genetic causes of schizophrenia. There's a strong evidence for genetic component of schizophrenia. If we have identical twins, our twin studies show that if one of the twins has schizophrenia, it's a 50-50 chance that the other twin will also have schizophrenia. And the Genane quadruplets are one of the early cases that we use to as an evidence for a hereditary component to schizophrenia. So these were four identical little girls born in the 1950s, I believe, 1940s, and they all had schizophrenia. So really, really sad. We used to think that environment was a major cause of schizophrenia, that, the person was abused or had a disturbed family environment, and that's absolutely not the case today. We don't believe that. Many people with schizophrenia grew up in a really healthy, happy family, and something just changed in their brain during adolescence and early adulthood. So schizophrenia is equally common in men and women, and it's found across cultures, and it's also been found across time. There's many historical documentations of the symptoms of schizophrenia. So it's something that's been around for a really long time. I'm not going to talk about childhood disorders, and schizophrenia is occasionally diagnosed in childhood, but there's a lot of controversy about that, and I personally don't think it should ever be diagnosed in childhood. However, However, like 12 years old, 11 years old, sometimes if there's a strong family history of schizophrenia, you can see early signs of schizophrenia at a really young age. I don't know if you guys remember that Slender Man case where there was two young girls that tried to kill their friend because Slender Man told them to do it, and Slender Man's a fictional character. Those girls both had some psychotic symptoms, and they were, I think, 10, 11, 12, I'm not sure exactly. So definitely children can have some psychotic symptoms, especially early adolescence, in adolescence, of course, too. But it's definitely not schizophrenia is something that really is diagnosed late adolescence, early adulthood. And this is just a chart that explains the evidence for hereditary or a genetic component. So if you had a grandparent that had schizophrenia, you have a 5% chance. So you have a higher percentage than the rest of the population, but it's not a huge percentage. So schizophrenia is one of the psychological disorders we know that has a very strong biological basis. So people with schizophrenia have high levels of the neurotransmitter dopamine, and we have antipsychotic medications that reduce that level of dopamine. And it does help, especially with the hallucinations, the auditory hallucinations, and many of the other hallucination symptoms. It doesn't really touch the delusional symptoms, and it does help a little bit with the thought process as well. So, as with any of our psychological disorders, the medication doesn't cure schizophrenia. It treats the symptoms, but it doesn't cure it. There is some new research on adolescent brain development, and what it's suggesting is that there's this huge surge of brain development during adolescence. We used to think that there was only this huge surge of brain development from infant to 3 years old, when kids are learning all their physical skills and language skills, and there is a huge amount of brain development going on then. But now we're recognizing that during adolescence there is a huge amount of brain growth as well. Lots of brain connections are being made. Think about the ability to have abstract thinking, hypothetical thinking, judgment. All of those things are developing in your late teens, early 20s. So it makes some sense that there might be a correlation with schizophrenia there, that something maybe is going wrong at that particular stage. We know brain activity looks different in people with schizophrenia or that are going through a schizophrenic episode. And then we also could look at it also appears that brain shrinkage may occur. If you look at this healthy twin and then the twin with the schizophrenia, you can see that the ventricles here are much larger. There's a lot more spinal fluid in here. And you look around the edges of the brain here, it's almost as if the brain has shrunk. So it seems like it attacks the brain. And for some people, it can be really severe, and for other people, it can be really mild. I wanted to mention a little bit about marijuana use in schizophrenia. There are some psychologists that believe that marijuana causes schizophrenia. I totally disagree with that. There is a correlation between marijuana use and schizophrenia, but we don't know if that correlation is due to the fact that people with schizophrenia often use marijuana to reduce their symptoms. But there has not been an increase in schizophrenia the rate of schizophrenia has remained at 1%. So if marijuana caused schizophrenia, I think we'd have a lot more people diagnosed with schizophrenia. I do think that if somebody is vulnerable to schizophrenia, already has some symptoms, it might make those symptoms occur a little bit sooner, but they would have needed to be there beforehand. But there's definitely concern over the effects of marijuana use or any drug or alcohol while the mind is developing during adolescence and young adulthood. So it's something to think about, but I wanted to mention that. So these are some of the antipsychotic medications that we have. The first ones were developed in the 1950s. Thorazine and Haldol you may have heard of. Unfortunately, after about 10 years or so, they discovered that there were some pretty severe negative side effects with Thorazine and Haldol. It caused permanent neurological damage. People had tics and difficulty walking. I have a picture for one of my other classes where a man had his tongue sticking out permanently. And unfortunately, even after stopping the medication, that damage already occurred, and it couldn't be reversed. So we do have newer antipsychotic medications that were developed in the 1980s. These are some of them here. There are fewer side effects, and they also act on the serotonin system as well as the dopamine. So these medications can help with schizophrenia. They can help reduce the symptoms, but they're not a cure. And the severity of schizophrenia can definitely range from mild to really severe and debilitating. But there are many people that can function with mild forms of schizophrenia, and they can learn to deal with the voices and some of the delusions and keep their thoughts clear. So it's something that I think it's really important with any of the psychological disorders to get help as soon as possible when you have these symptoms, because I think more damage occurs the longer you go untreated. So something to think about. But many of this stuff is not something, it's biological, it's not the person's fault, and it's not something we can completely fix. And counseling can help with schizophrenia, but medication is definitely a primary component of treating schizophrenia. So I wanted to talk quickly about dissociative identity disorder. It used to be called multiple personality disorders. And this is where we think the person has two or more separate personalities or identities. The movie Sybil came out in 1976, and she had this is not a true story, I don't believe, but she had some really horrific childhood abuse, and oftentimes people or children that are abused, and probably adults as well, learn to do what we call dissociate. Put themselves in another place when they're experiencing horrific abuse, so they don't separate themselves from it. Kind of just like us when we maybe go to the dentist office and we try to imagine we're somewhere else. Dissociation is something that we all do. It has kind of a big word to it, but really when we're daydreaming or even during meditation, we're sort of dissociating, we're sort of checking out for a little bit, and as long as we can control it, it's absolutely not a problem. It's not a symptom. But if you think about people with post-traumatic stress disorder and people with dissociative identity disorder, they often check out when they don't want to in the middle of something that's important, and they feel like they can't control that. And also think about actors and performers. They often sort of dissociate into that character or that performer, but they're in control of it, and that's okay. So dissociation becomes a problem when you can't control it. So in the 1980s, when Sybil came out, there was this book about Billy Milligan. He had 26 different personalities, supposedly. It was a really big diagnosis at the time, but there's a big question now as to whether multiple personalities really exist at all. And it's definitely completely different from schizophrenia. And we definitely question whether multiple personalities exist at all. So dissociating by itself doesn't mean you have a disorder. There are other dissociative disorders as well, and dissociation absolutely does occur, and it can become a problem for some people. And one last note here, this movie Split was supposedly I never saw it actually, but there's a lot of criticism of it because it's pretty inaccurate about people with dissociative identity disorder, and also really negative about people with dissociative identity disorder. They're not violent, and um, it's not in any way accurate. It's Hollywood. So on that note, thank you all for listening.